I never thought $28,000 would destroy my family, but when my father found it hidden under my mattress and declared he had already spent every penny on my sister's honeymoon, my world collapsed. The money wasn't mine to lose. It belonged to my grandfather, who had entrusted me with his life savings for safekeeping after his recent hospital scare. Now, as Grandpa Joe walked through our front door asking for his money back, my father's face turned ghostly white, and I realized our family was about to implode. My name is Holly, and at 28 years old, I thought I had seen enough drama to last a lifetime. Working as a dental hygienist in suburban Denver, I'd been living with my parents temporarily since my divorce 6 months earlier. The arrangement was supposed to be short-term, just until I saved enough for my own place. Living in my childhood bedroom felt like stepping backward, but it gave me time to rebuild my finances and figure out my next move. 3 months ago, everything changed when Grandpa Joe suffered what doctors called a mild heart attack. My mother's father had always been the strongest person I knew, a retired mechanic who could fix anything with his weathered hands. Seeing him in that hospital bed connected to monitors and looking smaller than I'd ever imagined shook our entire family to its core. But what really worried us wasn't just his physical recovery. Grandpa Joe, who had always been sharp as a tack, started expressing paranoid thoughts about banks and the government. He'd lived through the Great Depression as a child, and those old fears seemed to resurface with his health scare. He became convinced that banks were going to steal his money, that his memory was failing, and that he needed to protect his life savings somehow. That's when he came to me with a request that would change everything. One evening, while my parents were at my sister Madison's engagement party, Grandpa Joe pulled me aside in his living room. His hands shook slightly as he reached into an old shoebox hidden behind his recliner. "Holly, honey, I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. "I don't trust those banks anymore, and my mind isn't what it used to be. I need someone I can count on to keep this safe." Inside that shoebox was $28,000 in cash, crisp bills bundled with rubber bands representing decades of careful saving from his modest pension and Social Security. It was everything he had in the world beyond his small house. "Why me, Grandpa?" I asked, overwhelmed by the responsibility. "Because you're the only one who visits me just to visit," he replied. "Not because you need something or want something. You come by with groceries and help with my yard work without being asked. I trust you, sweetheart." I promised him I'd keep it safe hiding the money under my mattress in my childhood bedroom. It seemed secure enough for temporary storage until his paranoia subsided and he felt comfortable with banks again. I never imagined that decision would nearly destroy our family. My younger sister, Madison, 25, and glowing with engagement bliss, had become the center of our family's attention. Her fiancé, Trevor, came from a wealthy family, and Madison had developed expensive tastes to match. Their engagement party had been an elaborate affair at the country club, complete with ice sculptures and a 7-course dinner that probably cost more than I made in 2 months. The wedding planning had consumed our mother, Carol, completely. She spent her days researching venues, tasting cakes, and shopping for the perfect dress. Madison had her heart set on a destination wedding, followed by an extended honeymoon in Belize, and the costs kept climbing higher than our family could realistically afford. My father, Dale, had been struggling since his construction business hit a rough patch. The housing market had slowed down and several large contracts fell through. He tried to hide his stress, but I noticed him staying up late at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and unpaid bills scattered around him. Still, he wanted to give Madison everything she dreamed of for her special day. I'd been careful about the hidden money, checking on it regularly, and keeping Grandpa Joe updated about its safety. He seemed to be improving physically, though his paranoia about financial institutions remained strong. I figured eventually he'd feel secure enough to put the money back in a bank, and my temporary guardianship would end. That morning started like any other. I left early for work, seeing patients and cleaning teeth while chatting about weekend plans and summer vacation destinations. When I returned home around 5:30 in the afternoon, I expected to find the house quiet and peaceful. Instead, I discovered my bedroom door wide open and my father standing in the middle of the room with his hands empty and guilt written across his face. My mattress had been pulled away from the wall, my sheets were disheveled, and the shoebox I'd used to store Grandpa Joe's money was sitting open and completely empty on my dresser. "Dad, what are you doing in my room?" I asked, though the sick feeling in my stomach already told me the answer. Dale turned around slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that looked like panic. "Holly, I can explain everything. This isn't what you think." But it was exactly what I thought and so much worse. "I found the money under your mattress," he said quietly. "I assumed it was savings from your divorce settlement money you'd been hiding away. Madison needed help with her honeymoon expenses, and we've been so stressed about the wedding costs." My heart stopped. "Dad, where is the money now?" His silence told me everything I needed to know, but he confirmed my worst fears anyway. I already wired it to the resort in Belize. The honeymoon package required full payment up front, and Madison was so excited about the ocean view suite and the couple's spa treatments. $28,000, my grandfather's entire life savings, gone. The devastating twist that made my stomach drop to the floor was realizing that my father had no idea whose money he'd stolen. He thought he was borrowing from his daughter's savings account, not stealing from an elderly man who'd survived the Great Depression and trusted me with everything he had in the world. As I stood there trying to process the magnitude of what had happened, I heard the familiar sound of Grandpa Joe's old pickup truck pulling into our driveway. Through my bedroom window, I watched him slowly climb out of his vehicle, moving more carefully than he used to, but with the determined purpose I knew meant he had something important to discuss. "Dad, you have to call the resort right now and cancel that transaction," I said, my voice shaking as Grandpa Joe's footsteps approached our front door. "That money doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to any of us." Dale's face went from red with embarrassment to white with confusion. "What do you mean it doesn't belong to you? It was in your room, under your mattress. I thought you were saving it for your new apartment." The doorbell rang, followed by Grandpa Joe's familiar knock. He always did both, a habit from his generation that respected formality even with family. My heart raced as I realized I had maybe 60 seconds to explain the situation before he walked in expecting to collect his life savings. "That money belongs to Grandpa Joe," I whispered urgently. "He asked me to keep it safe after his heart attack because he doesn't trust banks anymore. He gave me his entire life savings to protect, and you just spent it on Madison's honeymoon." The color drained completely from Dale's face. I watched him process the full weight of what he'd done, the reality hitting him like a physical blow. He'd stolen from his wife's elderly father, a man who'd welcomed him into the family 40 years ago, and treated him like a son. "Oh God," Dale whispered. "Oh God, Holly, what have I done?" Before I could respond, we heard Carol's cheerful voice greeting Grandpa Joe in the living room. "Dad, what a nice surprise. Come in, come in. Dale and Holly are upstairs." I grabbed my father's arm. "You have to fix this. Call the resort, call the bank, call whoever you need to call. Get that money back before Grandpa finds out what happened." But Dale was already shaking his head. "I can't, Holly. The resort required a wire transfer for international bookings. They said it was final, no refunds, especially for peak season reservations. Madison insisted we book the most expensive package because Trevor's family expects luxury accommodations." My stomach twisted as the full scope of our family's dysfunction became clear. Madison had been pressuring our parents for months about wedding expenses, creating elaborate wish lists and throwing tantrums when anyone suggested scaling back her plans. Our mother, Carol, had supported every demand, afraid of disappointing her younger daughter during such an important time in her life. "You should have asked me before taking money from my room," I said, trying to keep my voice down as footsteps climbed the stairs toward my bedroom. "Madison said you were being selfish about helping with wedding costs," Dale replied defensively. "She said you had plenty of money saved up, but you were holding back because you were jealous of her happiness." The revelation that my sister had been manipulating our parents behind my back while I was secretly protecting our grandfather's life savings, felt like a betrayal within a betrayal. Madison knew I was struggling financially after my divorce. She knew I was living with our parents because I couldn't afford my own place yet, but she'd convinced them I was hoarding money out of spite. "Holly, honey, your grandfather wants to see you," Carol called from the hallway, her voice getting closer to my open door. There was no more time for explanations or desperate planning. Grandpa Joe appeared in my doorway looking smaller than usual, but carrying himself with the dignity he'd maintained throughout his 82 years of life. He wore his Sunday shirt and clean jeans, dressed up for what he clearly considered an important errand. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, smiling at me with genuine warmth before noticing Dale's presence and guilty expression. "Dale, good to see you too. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." "Of course not, Dad." Dale managed, though his voice cracked slightly. "You're always welcome here." Grandpa Joe nodded politely, then turned his attention back to me. "Holly, I hate to bother you, but I need to collect that money I asked you to keep safe. My doctor called this afternoon with some news about my treatment options." The room fell silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I looked at my father, hoping he would step up and confess what he'd done, but Dale seemed frozen with shame and panic. "What kind of treatment options?" I asked, stalling for time while trying to figure out how to handle this disaster. Grandpa Joe's expression grew serious. "Well, honey, it turns out my heart condition is more complicated than we initially thought. The cardiologist wants me to see a specialist about a procedure that might help, but it's not covered by Medicare. I need that $28,000 for the consultation and potential treatment." The devastating twist hit me like a physical blow. The money hadn't just been Grandpa Joe's general life savings. It was specifically earmarked for medical treatment that could save his life. My father hadn't just stolen an elderly man's nest egg. He'd stolen money that could determine whether my grandfather lived or died. "Dad." I started looking desperately at my father. But Dale's face had gone beyond pale to a sickly gray color. He looked like he might faint or vomit, and I realized he was finally understanding the true magnitude of his actions. This wasn't about family finances or wedding expenses anymore. This was about my grandfather's survival. "The money," Grandpa Joe said, gently extending his weathered hand. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I really do need it back now." Carol appeared behind him in the doorway, curious about our serious conversation. "What money?" she asked innocently. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was nowhere left to hide. Grandpa Joe asked me to keep some money safe for him," I said, carefully watching Dale's face grow more ashen by the second. "He's been worried about banks since his heart attack." Carol looked puzzled but not yet alarmed. "Oh, that's thoughtful of you, honey. Dad, how much money are we talking about?" $28,000, Grandpa Joe replied matter-of-factly. "It's everything I have saved up for my medical expenses. Holly's been kind enough to keep it secure while I decide on my treatment options." The silence that followed felt like the calm before a tornado. I watched my mother's face change as she processed the enormous sum, then noticed my father's guilty expression, then began putting together the pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. "Dale," Carol said slowly, her voice taking on a warning tone I recognized from my childhood, "you didn't." But before Dale could confess or deny anything, we heard the front door slam and Madison's voice calling from downstairs. "Mom, Dad, where is everyone? I have amazing news about the Honeymoon resort." My sister's timing couldn't have been worse. She bounded up the stairs with the energy of someone whose biggest concern was choosing between champagne or wine pairings for her reception dinner. Madison appeared in my crowded bedroom doorway, wearing a flowing sundress that probably cost more than I made in a week, her engagement ring catching the afternoon light as she gestured enthusiastically. The resort confirmed our ocean view suite, and they included complimentary couples, massages, and a private beach dinner. She announced breathlessly before noticing the tension in the room. "Why does everyone look so serious?" "Madison, we need to talk," I said, my voice strained with the effort of staying calm. But Grandpa Joe spoke first, his polite confusion evident in his tone. "Madison, sweetheart, congratulations on your engagement. I'm just here to collect some money I left with Holly for safekeeping." Madison's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something I couldn't quite identify crossing her face. "Oh, what money is that?" $28,000 for my heart treatment," Grandpa Joe explained patiently. "I gave it to Holly because I've been having concerns about banking security." I watched Madison's face carefully as the information sank in. Instead of surprise or concern, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Recognition. She knew about the money. "Madison," I said quietly, "did you know about Grandpa's money when you were pressuring Dad about honeymoon expenses?" The devastating twist that shattered my remaining faith in my sister came in her response. Madison lifted her chin defiantly, showing none of the shame or remorse I expected from someone who just learned about a terrible mistake. "I saw Dad searching your room 3 days ago," she said with a shrug. "He was stressed about wedding costs, and I told him that if you had money hidden away, maybe it was time for you to contribute to family expenses instead of being so selfish." The room erupted in shocked voices. Carol gasped audibly. Dale made a strangled sound of protest. Grandpa Joe took a step backward as if he'd been physically struck. But Madison wasn't finished. "Look, I didn't know it was Grandpa's money specifically, but honestly, what does he need $28,000 for anyway? He's 82 years old. It's not like he's going to buy a sports car or take a world cruise." "Madison Elizabeth," Carol said sharply, using my sister's full name in a tone that could have frozen water. "That is completely inappropriate." "Is it?" Madison challenged. "Grandpa has lived his whole life. He's had his fun, he's raised his family, he's accomplished what he's going to accomplish. Meanwhile, Trevor and I are just starting our lives together, and this honeymoon is a once-in-a-lifetime experience." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my little sister, the girl I'd protected from bullies and helped with homework and cheered on at cheerleading competitions. Somewhere along the way, she'd become someone I didn't recognize. "The money is for his heart treatment," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "He could die without it." Madison rolled her eyes in a gesture so callous it took my breath away. "Everyone dies eventually, Holly. At least this way the money goes towards something beautiful and meaningful instead of just prolonging the inevitable." Grandpa Joe made a small sound almost like a whimper, and I saw him reach for the door frame to steady himself. The stress and shock of discovering that his granddaughter viewed his life as expendable was affecting his already fragile heart condition. "You need to sit down, Grandpa," I said, moving toward him with concern. But he waved me away, his dignity intact despite his obvious pain. "I think I understand the situation now," he said quietly. "My money is gone spent on a vacation for someone who believes I should just accept dying because I'm inconveniently old." The raw hurt in his voice broke something inside me. This man had worked his entire life, saved every penny, lived through wars and economic hardships, raised a family, and contributed to his community for over 8 decades. He deserved better than having his own granddaughter dismiss his life as meaningless. Dale finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought it was Holly's money. If I had known—" "If you had known, you would have asked my permission before spending my life savings on a luxury vacation," Grandpa Joe finished firmly. "But that's not really the point anymore, is it?" He looked around the room at each of us, his gaze lingering longest on Madison. "The point is that my granddaughter thinks my life has so little value that I should quietly accept death so she can have a more expensive honeymoon." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Madison seemed to realize she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "We need to find a solution," I said, breaking the terrible silence that had settled over my bedroom. "Madison, you have to contact the resort and cancel the honeymoon package. We need to get Grandpa's money back immediately." Madison's defiant expression faltered slightly, but she shook her head. "It's impossible, Holly. The resort has a strict no-refund policy for international bookings. They made that very clear when we signed the contracts." "What contracts?" Carol asked sharply. I don't remember seeing any paperwork. Trevor handled most of the booking details, Madison replied evasively. His family has experience with luxury travel arrangements. I studied my sister's face, noting how she avoided direct eye contact when discussing the resort details. Something about her explanation didn't feel right, but before I could press for more information, Dale's behavior took an alarming turn. My father began pacing the small confines of my bedroom like a caged animal, running his hands through his thinning hair and muttering under his breath. The guilt and panic were clearly overwhelming him, and I realized he was on the verge of a complete breakdown. "Dale, you need to calm down," Carol said, reaching for his arm as he passed by the window. "Calm down," Dale's voice cracked as he spun to face her. "I just stole $28,000 from your father, money he needs for heart surgery. How exactly am I supposed to calm down?" The defensive edge in his tone suggested there was more to this story than simple desperation about wedding expenses. Dale's reaction seemed disproportionate, even considering the gravity of taking Grandpa Joe's medical fund. "Dad," I said gently, "there has to be a way to fix this. Maybe the resort has a cancellation department, or we could dispute the wire transfer through the bank." Dale stopped pacing and looked at me with eyes that held more fear than I'd ever seen. "You don't understand, Holly. The money is already gone, completely gone. And even if we could somehow get it back, it wouldn't solve our real problem." "What real problem?" Carol demanded, her voice taking on the sharp tone she used when she suspected Dale was hiding something from her. The devastating twist that would change everything came when my father finally broke down completely. His shoulders sagged as years of hidden stress and financial pressure finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain the facade of stability he'd been projecting. "My construction business isn't just slow," Dale admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's completely bankrupt, has been for 6 months. The room fell silent except for Carol's sharp intake of breath and Grandpa Joe's quiet sigh of understanding. My business partner Greg disappeared in February with over $50,000 in client deposits. Dale continued, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. "Left me holding contracts I couldn't fulfill and bills I couldn't pay. I've been trying to keep the company afloat ever since, borrowing against our house, maxing out credit cards, anything to avoid losing everything." Carol's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt anger, and finally a kind of numb acceptance. 6 months, Dale. You've been lying to me for 6 months. "I thought I could fix it," he said desperately. "I kept thinking if I could just find one big project, or if somehow I could raise enough capital to fulfill the existing contracts, I could save the business and pay back the missing deposits." "How much do we owe?" Carol asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really want to know the answer. Dale's silence stretched on so long that I began to understand the true scope of our family's financial disaster. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow with defeat. "Between the missing client deposits, unpaid subcontractors' equipment loans, and the money I borrowed against our house, we're looking at about $120,000 in debt." Grandpa Joe made a small sound of distress, and I realized the stress of learning about our family's deception was taking a visible toll on his health. His breathing had become slightly labored, and he was gripping the door frame more tightly than before. "Grandpa, please sit down," I urged, guiding him toward the chair at my old desk. As he settled carefully into the seat, I could see him processing not just the loss of his money, but the revelation that his daughter's family was in complete financial ruin. The man who'd lived through the Great Depression was watching his own children make the same kinds of desperate financial decisions that had destroyed so many families in his youth. "So, when you found what you thought was my money," I said to Dale, "you saw it as a solution to multiple problems." "I saw it as a miracle," he admitted. $28,000 would cover Madison's wedding expenses and give me a little breathing room to figure out the business situation. I thought I was borrowing from my daughter's divorce settlement money you could afford to lend to help the family. The irony was devastating. While Dale was desperately searching for money to save our family from financial ruin, the cash he found represented the life savings of a man who'd spent decades carefully preparing for exactly this kind of emergency. Grandpa Joe's Depression-era mentality of saving for medical emergencies and unexpected hardships had been exactly right, but his money had been stolen by family members who'd never learned those hard-earned lessons about financial responsibility. "Dad needs to go to the hospital," I said, noticing that Grandpa Joe's breathing was becoming more irregular. "This stress isn't good for his heart condition." Carol looked at her father with growing alarm. "Dad, how are you feeling? Should I call an ambulance?" "I'm all right, sweetheart," Grandpa Joe said softly, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "I just need to understand what happens next. If my money is truly gone, I need to know what my medical options are." The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. My grandfather's life was hanging in the balance. My father's business was destroyed. My family was financially ruined, and my sister seemed more concerned about her honeymoon than any of the real problems we were facing. As I looked around the room at my fractured family, I realized that someone had to take charge of this situation before we lost more than just money. We were on the verge of losing Grandpa Joe and possibly our family entirely. "I'm calling 911. I announced, pulling out my phone as Grandpa Joe's breathing became more labored. "This stress is too much for your heart, Grandpa." "Holly, don't make a fuss," he protested weakly, but the slight blue tinge around his lips told me everything I needed to know about his condition. Within minutes, paramedics arrived at our house, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to our family's emotional chaos. As they checked Grandpa Joe's vital signs and administered oxygen, I explained his recent heart attack and the stressful situation that had triggered this episode. "We're going to transport him to Denver Presbyterian for evaluation," the lead paramedic informed us. "His heart rhythm is irregular and his blood pressure is elevated. Given his recent cardiac event, we want to be cautious." I rode in the ambulance with Grandpa Joe holding his weathered hand while the paramedics monitored his condition. Dale and Carol followed in their car while Madison stayed behind, claiming she needed to make important phone calls about wedding arrangements. Even in a medical emergency, her priorities remained unchanged. At the hospital, we waited in the sterile emergency department while doctors ran tests and evaluations. The fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smell brought back memories of Grandpa Joe's previous heart attack, but this time felt different, more serious, more final. After what felt like hours, Dr. Martinez, a cardiologist I remembered from Grandpa Joe's earlier treatment, emerged from the examination room with an expression that made my stomach drop. "I'd like to speak with the family," she said, gesturing toward a private consultation room. Once we were seated in the small, windowless space, Dr. Martinez opened Grandpa Joe's chart and delivered news that changed everything I thought I understood about his condition. The devastating twist that shattered my remaining hope came in her clinical explanation of his test results. "I'm afraid Mr. Joseph's condition is significantly more severe than we initially diagnosed," Dr. Martinez began. "The stress test and cardiac imaging we completed today show extensive coronary artery disease with multiple blockages. His ejection fraction has declined substantially since his last visit." Carol gripped my hand tightly. "What does that mean for his treatment options?" "Traditional bypass surgery is no longer viable given his age and the extent of the damage," the cardiologist explained gently. "However, there is an experimental procedure being offered at the University of Colorado Hospital. It's a minimally invasive technique that could restore some cardiac function, but it's not covered by Medicare because it's still in clinical trials." "How much does it cost?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would crush what little hope we had left. "The procedure itself plus the required follow-up care runs approximately $28,000, Dr. Martinez replied. "It's not a guarantee, but given Mr. Joseph's current trajectory, it represents his best chance for meaningful recovery." The exact amount of money that was currently funding Madison's honeymoon in Belize, the precise sum that could save our grandfather's life, was at this very moment paying for couples' massages and private beach dinners. How much time do we have to make a decision? Dale asked, his voice hollow with guilt. Based on today's test results, I'd recommend proceeding within the next 72 hours, Dr. Martinez said. Mr. Joseph's condition is deteriorating more rapidly than we anticipated. After the doctor left to check on other patients, our family sat in stunned silence. The consultation room felt like a tomb, airless and confining, while we processed the reality that Grandpa Joe was dying, and the money that could save him was unreachable on a tropical island. I have to try calling the resort again, Dale said finally. Maybe if I explain that it's a medical emergency? You already tried that, Carol replied listlessly. They said their no refund policy applies to all bookings regardless of circumstances. I thought about Madison back at home, probably researching spa treatments and excursion packages, while her grandfather lay in a hospital bed fighting for his life. The contrast between her excitement about luxury amenities and Grandpa Joe's struggle for survival felt like a moral chasm that could never be bridged. There has to be something we can do, I insisted. Some way to get the money back or find alternative funding. Dale shook his head slowly. I already mortgaged everything we own to try saving the business. Our credit is maxed out and the bank won't approve any more loans. I destroyed our family's financial credibility along with everything else. As we sat there feeling helpless, a nurse knocked on the consultation room door. Excuse me, but Mr. Joseph is asking to see his granddaughter, Holly. He's stable for now, but he'd like to speak with you privately. I found Grandpa Joe propped up in his hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than ever against the white sheets. Oxygen tubes ran to his nose, and multiple monitors tracked his vital signs with steady electronic beeping. Come here, sweetheart, he said softly, patting the edge of his bed. I sat carefully beside him, trying not to disturb the various wires and tubes. How are you feeling, Grandpa? Like an old man whose heart is giving out, he replied with a weak smile. But that's not why I wanted to talk to you. I need you to understand something important about what happened today. I waited for him to continue, afraid of what he might say. What your father did was wrong, Grandpa Joe said quietly, but I don't want you carrying guilt about this, Holly. You did exactly what I asked you to do. You kept my money safe and secure. What happened after that wasn't your fault. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I realized he was trying to comfort me while facing his own mortality. But if I hadn't hidden it under my mattress, if I'd put it somewhere Dale couldn't find it, then you would have been going against my wishes, he interrupted gently. I asked you to keep it accessible in case I needed it quickly. You honored that request perfectly. The devastating revelation came in what he said next. Holly, I need to tell you something about that money. Grandpa Joe continued, his voice growing weaker. It wasn't just my general savings. It was everything I had left in the world specifically set aside for medical expenses. When I gave it to you, I already knew my condition was more serious than I let on. My heart sank as I understood the full scope of what he was telling me. You knew you might need surgery. I've known for months, he admitted. But I didn't want to worry your mother or become a burden on the family. I thought if I could just save up enough money quietly, I could handle whatever medical treatment I needed without asking anyone for help. The irony was crushing. While our family was falling apart over wedding expenses and financial pressures, Grandpa Joe had been silently preparing to pay for his own survival, asking nothing from anyone except secure storage for his carefully saved funds. That's why I trusted you with the money, he said, squeezing my hand with what strength he had left. You were the only one who visited me regularly without wanting anything in return. I knew you'd protect it until I needed it. As I sat beside his hospital bed listening to the steady rhythm of machines keeping my grandfather alive, I realized that everything had changed. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money anymore. This was about fighting for the life of the most honorable man I'd ever known, and I was going to find a way to save him no matter what it took. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to the office of Patricia Henley, a family attorney I'd found through an online search. Her law firm specialized in elder abuse cases, and after explaining our situation over the phone, she agreed to see me immediately. Patricia's office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown, with warm wood paneling and built-in bookshelves that suggested both competence and compassion. As I sat across from her desk recounting the events of the past 24 hours, I watched her take detailed notes with growing concern. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," Patricia said after I finished my explanation. "Your grandfather entrusted you with $28,000 in cash for safekeeping. Your father found this money in your bedroom and, believing it belonged to you, used it to pay for your sister's honeymoon expenses. Your grandfather now needs this exact amount for life-saving medical treatment." "That's correct," I confirmed. "And my sister knew my father was looking for money. She encouraged him to take whatever he found in my room." Patricia set down her pen and looked at me seriously. "Holly, I need to explain the legal implications of this situation, and some of what I'm going to tell you may be difficult to hear." The devastating twist that made my situation even more complicated came in her next words. "From a legal standpoint, you were acting as an informal custodian of your grandfather's funds. While your intentions were honorable, the fact that you allowed the money to be accessible in your home creates some liability issues." My heart sank. What kind of liability? "If your grandfather decides to file criminal charges or pursue civil action, the prosecutor or plaintiff's attorney could argue that you failed in your duty to properly secure the funds," Patricia explained. "Keeping that much cash under a mattress while honoring your grandfather's wishes doesn't meet the standard of care typically expected for custodial arrangements." I felt sick. "So I could be held legally responsible for the theft?" "It's possible," she admitted. "Your father's actions clearly constitute theft, but since you were the official custodian, you could be named as a co-defendant in any legal proceedings." The irony was devastating. In trying to honor my grandfather's request and protect his money, I had inadvertently created legal exposure for myself. My good intentions had put me at risk of criminal charges. "However," Patricia continued, "there are some positive aspects to your situation. First, you have clear documentation of your grandfather's request, assuming he would testify on your behalf. Second, your father's actions were unauthorized and clearly constitute conversion of funds. Third, the urgency of your grandfather's medical situation creates compelling circumstances for pursuing aggressive recovery options." "What kind of recovery options?" "We can contact the resort directly and demand return of the funds based on fraudulent circumstances," she explained. "Since your father used money that didn't belong to him, the transaction itself could be considered fraudulent. We can also file a police report for elder abuse and theft, which might encourage the resort to cooperate." I thought about the impact criminal charges would have on my family. Dale was already devastated by guilt Carol was struggling to process the betrayal, and Madison seemed oblivious to the severity of what had happened. "There's something else you should know," Patricia said. "Elder abuse cases are taken very seriously in Colorado. Given your grandfather's age and medical condition, this could result in felony charges for both your father and potentially your sister, depending on her level of involvement." The weight of potentially sending my own family members to prison felt overwhelming. But as I thought about Grandpa Joe lying in that hospital bed, fighting for his life, while his money funded luxury spa treatments, my resolve strengthened. "What about the resort?" I asked. "Do they have any legal obligation to return money that was obtained through theft?" "International transactions complicate things," Patricia admitted. "However, if the payment was processed through a U.S.-based credit card or banking system, we have more options. We can file disputes with the credit card company, contact the Federal Trade Commission, and potentially pursue legal action in U.S. courts." As we discussed the various legal strategies, my phone rang. Carol's name appeared on the screen, and I could hear the panic in her voice before I even answered. "Holly, you need to get to the hospital right away," she said breathlessly. "Something's happened with Madison and Trevor." I excused myself from Patricia's office and drove to the hospital with my heart racing. When I arrived at the cardiac unit, I found Carol pacing the waiting area with obvious distress. "What happened?" I asked immediately. "Trevor came to visit your grandfather," Carol explained. "Madison brought him to show how seriously she's taking the family situation. But when Grandpa Joe explained what happened to his money, Trevor's reaction was—" She paused, searching for the right words. "It was not what Madison expected." I followed Carol to Grandpa Joe's room where I could hear raised voices coming from inside. Through the partially open door, I saw Madison standing defensively near the window, while a tall, well-dressed young man I assumed was Trevor stood by my grandfather's bedside with an expression of horror. "You knew this money belonged to your grandfather," Trevor was saying, his voice filled with disbelief. "You knew he needed it for medical treatment, and you still encouraged your father to steal it." "It's not stealing when it's family money," Madison replied, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "And I didn't know it was specifically for medical treatment." "That doesn't matter," Trevor said firmly. "You knew it wasn't your money to take. You knew your grandfather is elderly and vulnerable. How could you possibly think this was acceptable?" The devastating revelation came when Trevor turned to address my grandfather directly. "Mr. Joseph, I want you to know that my family and I had no knowledge of these circumstances when we approved Madison's engagement," he said formally. "If we had understood that wedding expenses were being funded through elder abuse, we never would have supported this relationship." Madison's face went white. "Trevor, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I can't marry someone who would steal from their own grandfather," Trevor replied without hesitation. "This isn't about money or wedding expenses. This is about basic human decency, and you've shown me exactly who you are as a person." As I watched my sister's engagement crumble in real time, I realized that the consequences of the stolen money were spreading far beyond medical bills and legal troubles. Our family's moral foundation was collapsing, and everyone was being forced to choose sides between right and wrong. That evening, I returned to Patricia Henley's office with a new sense of urgency. Trevor's reaction had shown me that people of integrity would not tolerate Madison's behavior, and I needed to explore every possible legal avenue for recovering Grandpa Joe's money. "I want to file a police report," I told Patricia as soon as I sat down, "and I want to pursue every option for getting that money back from the resort." Patricia nodded approvingly. "I think that's the right decision. Let me start by contacting the resort directly while you file the police report. Sometimes international businesses are more cooperative when they know law enforcement is involved." She handed me a card for Detective Sarah Rodriguez with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims. Detective Rodriguez has excellent relationships with federal agencies that handle international fraud cases. She'll know how to approach this properly. While Patricia began researching the Belize Resort's corporate structure and payment processing systems, I drove to the sheriff's office to meet with Detective Rodriguez. Her office was cramped, but organized with case files stacked neatly on metal shelves and a whiteboard covered with investigation timelines. "Tell me about your grandfather's situation," Detective Rodriguez said after I explained why I was there. I walked her through the entire story from Grandpa Joe's initial request to Dale's theft to Madison's callous dismissal of our grandfather's life. Detective Rodriguez took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about dates, amounts, and exactly who knew what information when. "This is definitely elder abuse," she said firmly. "Your grandfather is a vulnerable adult, and your family members took advantage of his trust to steal money he needs for medical care. The fact that your sister knew about the theft and encouraged it makes her complicit." "What are the potential charges?" I asked. "For your father, we're looking at theft, elder abuse, and possibly fraud, depending on how he accessed the resort's payment system," Detective Rodriguez explained. "For your sister, accessory to theft and elder abuse. These are serious felonies that could result in significant prison time." The gravity of sending my own family to prison weighed heavily on me, but I thought about Grandpa Joe struggling to breathe in his hospital bed while my family's dysfunction threatened his life. There's something else I want to investigate, Detective Rodriguez continued. You mentioned that your sister claimed the resort has a no-refund policy, but international travel companies often make exceptions for fraud cases. I'd like to contact them directly and see if their story matches what your family has been told. The devastating twist came when Detective Rodriguez called the Belize resort from her office phone, putting the call on speaker so I could hear the conversation. Good afternoon, this is Detective Rodriguez with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Colorado. She began professionally. I'm investigating a case involving a payment made to your resort for a honeymoon package. The reservation was made under the names Madison Walsh and Trevor Patterson. There was a pause while the resort representative checked their system. When they came back on the line, their response changed everything. I'm sorry, Detective, but we have no record of any reservation under those names, the representative said clearly. We also show no payment received for a honeymoon package matching the dates and amount you've described. My heart stopped. Detective Rodriguez and I looked at each other with mutual understanding of what this revelation meant. Could you double-check the names and dates? Detective Rodriguez asked, though we both already knew what the answer would be. I've checked multiple spelling variations and expanded the date range, the representative confirmed. We have no booking or payment record for Madison Walsh, Trevor Patterson, or any combination of those names. After ending the call, Detective Rodriguez turned to me with a grim expression. Holly, your sister has been lying about the resort. The money didn't go to Belize at all. The full scope of Madison's deception hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't just encouraged the theft of Grandpa Joe's money, she had created an elaborate cover story to hide where the money actually went. If the money didn't go to the resort, where is it? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. That's what we're going to find out, Detective Rodriguez replied, opening a new case file. But given your sister's pattern of deception and manipulation, I suspect we'll discover she used your grandfather's money to pay off personal debts rather than wedding expenses. As I drove home from the sheriff's office, my mind raced with the implications of what we'd discovered. Madison's lies weren't just about protecting herself from family judgment. They represented a calculated scheme to steal money from our dying grandfather while maintaining the facade of wedding preparations. I thought about Trevor's horrified reaction earlier that day and realized he had dumped Madison based on incomplete information. If he knew the full extent of her deception and theft, his disgust would be even greater. When I arrived home, I found Dale sitting alone at the kitchen table with bank statements and financial documents spread out in front of him. He looked up when I entered, his face haggard with exhaustion and guilt. Holly, I've been trying to trace exactly where the money went, he said wearily. I thought I wired it directly to the resort, but now I'm not sure about anything. I sat down across from him, studying the paperwork. Dad, the police contacted the resort. They have no record of Madison's reservation or any payment. Dale's face went ashen. That's impossible. Madison gave me all the booking information, the confirmation numbers, everything. She lied, I said simply. The money didn't go to any resort. Madison has been deceiving all of us about where Grandpa's money really went. As the truth sank in, Dale's remaining composure cracked completely. What have I done? He whispered. I trusted her completely. I thought I was helping with legitimate wedding expenses, but she used me to steal from your grandfather. The realization that Madison had manipulated our father into committing elder abuse while lying about the circumstances made me understand that we weren't dealing with poor judgment or family financial stress. We were dealing with someone who had deliberately planned and executed a scheme to defraud our dying grandfather. Looking at my father's devastation and thinking about Grandpa Joe's deteriorating condition, I knew that uncovering the truth about Madison's deception was just the beginning. Now I had to figure out how to get the money back and save my grandfather's life before it was too late. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. After spending a sleepless night thinking about Grandpa Joe's deteriorating condition and our family's financial crisis, I created a crowdfunding campaign on GoFundMe titled, "Help Save My Grandfather's Life." I wrote the description carefully explaining Grandpa Joe's heart condition, his need for experimental treatment, and the theft of his medical fund by family members. I included photos of him from his military service, his retirement party from the auto shop, and recent pictures of him in the hospital. I was honest about the family dynamics without being vindictive, focusing on his character and the urgency of his medical situation. Within hours of posting the campaign, something remarkable began happening. Our neighbors started sharing the link on social media, and donations began trickling in along with messages of support for Grandpa Joe. But the real surprise came when people started sharing stories about my sister that I'd never heard before. Mrs. Patterson from down the street was one of the first to comment. "Joe Walsh is one of the finest men I've ever known. He helped my late husband repair our roof after the hailstorm 3 years ago and refused payment. However, I have to say, I'm not surprised about Madison's behavior. She borrowed $200 from me last Christmas for emergency car repairs and has been avoiding me ever since." The devastating revelation came as more neighbors and family friends began sharing similar experiences in the comments section. "Madison borrowed $500 from our mother's bridge club last spring," wrote Janet Morrison. "She said it was for medical bills, but we saw her shopping for designer clothes the next day. Mom was too embarrassed to ask for the money back. She convinced my teenage daughter to loan her $800 from her college savings account. Posted Rick Thompson. Told her it was just for a week while she waited for a paycheck. That was 6 months ago." As I read through the growing list of Madison's financial deceptions, a pattern emerged that shocked me. My sister had been systematically borrowing money from friends, neighbors, and even teenagers throughout our community, creating elaborate sob stories to justify each request and then disappearing when it came time to repay the loans. The crowdfunding campaign began gaining momentum as word spread about Grandpa Joe's situation and Madison's history of financial manipulation. People who had never met our grandfather started donating because they were outraged by the idea of someone stealing medical money from an elderly veteran. Carol called me that afternoon, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "Holly, I just got off the phone with my sister in Phoenix. She said Madison borrowed $3,000 from her last year for emergency dental work. We never knew about any dental problems. How much money has she stolen total?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I've been making phone calls all morning," Carol replied. "So far, I've found at least $12,000 in unpaid loans to family and friends, and those are just the people who admitted it. Some are too embarrassed to say anything." The scope of Madison's deception was staggering. She'd been operating like a con artist within her own community, targeting people who trusted her because of their relationship with our family. Her victims included elderly women from church teenagers, saving for college, and family members who'd helped her out of love and concern. But the community response to Grandpa Joe's crowdfunding campaign was equally remarkable. Donations kept coming in from people who shared memories of his kindness and integrity. His former co-workers from the auto shop contributed collectively. Veterans from his American Legion post organized a fundraising dinner. Even people who'd never met him donated because they were moved by his story. By the third day, the campaign had raised over $8,000 with new donations and shares appearing every hour. The comments section had become a tribute to Grandpa Joe's character and a record of Madison's financial crimes. That evening, Detective Rodriguez called with an update on her investigation. "Holly, we've traced the money your father wired. It didn't go to any resort in Belize. Madison provided fake booking information and had the $28,000 transferred to a personal account she opened at a credit union across town." "What did she use it for?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Credit card debt mostly," Detective Rodriguez confirmed. "She had balances on 7 different cards totaling over $26,000. She used your grandfather's money to pay them off. Plus, she took about $2,000 in cash for personal expenses." The devastating truth was that Madison had stolen our grandfather's life-saving medical fund to clean up her own financial mess. She'd accumulated massive debt through shopping and lifestyle expenses, then used elaborate lies to steal money from the most vulnerable member of our family. We have enough evidence to arrest her, Detective Rodriguez continued. But I wanted to give you a heads up first since this will obviously impact your family dynamics. As I thought about Madison being arrested while Grandpa Joe lay in a hospital bed fighting for his life, I realized that our family had reached a point of no return. The sister I'd grown up loving and protecting had become someone I no longer recognized, someone who would literally steal money from a dying man to fund her shopping addiction. That night, Trevor's parents, Robert and Patricia Patterson, came to visit our family. I'd met them briefly at the engagement party, but this was the first time we'd had a real conversation about the situation. Patricia was an elegant woman in her 50s who radiated the kind of quiet strength that comes from successfully navigating life's challenges. Robert was a distinguished-looking man who'd built his wealth through ethical business practices and community involvement. "We want to help," Patricia said simply as we sat in our living room. "Joe is clearly a remarkable man who doesn't deserve what's happened to him, but we also need to address the situation with Madison." The surprising twist came in what they offered next. "We're prepared to pay the full $28,000 for Joe's medical treatment," Robert announced, "but we have conditions that must be met before we'll release the funds." Carol gasped audibly. Dale looked like he might cry with relief. "First," Patricia continued, "Madison must undergo professional counseling for her gambling and spending addictions. Second, she must make restitution to everyone she's defrauded in this community. Third, she must agree to have no contact with our family, including Trevor, for at least 1 year, while she addresses her behavioral problems. And fourth," Robert added, "the wedding is postponed indefinitely. We will not allow our son to marry someone who steals from elderly relatives, regardless of how much therapy she receives." As I looked at these generous, principled people offering to save my grandfather's life while holding my sister accountable for her crimes, I realized that integrity and decency still existed in the world. The contrast between their values and Madison's behavior couldn't have been more stark. The next evening, Robert and Patricia Patterson requested a formal family meeting at our house. They arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, bringing with them an air of serious purpose that made it clear this wasn't a social visit. Patricia carried a leather portfolio, while Robert brought a briefcase that suggested they'd come prepared with legal documentation. Trevor accompanied them looking somber and older than his 27 years. The stress of the past week had clearly taken its toll on him as he processed the reality of who Madison truly was beneath her charming facade. Before we discuss our offer to help with Joe's medical expenses, Robert began settling into our living room chair with business-like formality. "We need to understand exactly what kind of family we've been considering joining." Carol and Dale sat stiffly on the couch, their discomfort obvious as they realized they were being evaluated by people whose judgment would determine not only Grandpa Joe's survival, but also Madison's future. "Where is Madison tonight?" Patricia asked pointedly. "She's staying at her friend Jessica's apartment," Carol replied carefully. "She said she needed time to think about everything that's happened." Trevor made a sound that might have been bitter laughter. "She's avoiding accountability just like she always does when she's caught in a lie." The devastating revelation came when Patricia opened her portfolio and pulled out a stack of documents. "We've been conducting our own investigation into Madison's background," she announced. "What we've discovered is deeply disturbing and goes far beyond the theft of Joe's medical money." She spread several papers across our coffee table, including credit reports, bank statements, and what appeared to be legal documents. "Madison has been living a completely fabricated lifestyle for the past 2 years," Patricia continued. "Her apartment rent is 4 months behind. She owes over $35,000 on various credit cards. She's defaulted on a car loan and has 3 outstanding payday loans with interest rates exceeding 400% annually." Dale's face went pale. "How is that even possible?" "Because she's addicted to spending money she doesn't have," Robert explained. "The designer clothes, expensive dinners, luxury spa treatments, weekend trips to Vail and Aspen that she posts on social media are all funded through debt and theft." Trevor spoke up for the first time since arriving. I never knew about any of this. Madison always insisted on splitting expenses equally, which I thought showed independence and self-respect. I had no idea she was financing her half through borrowed money and fraud. Patricia pulled out another document. This is particularly troubling. Madison has been forging her father's signature on loan applications using Dale's construction business as collateral without his knowledge. The room fell silent as we processed this information. Madison hadn't just stolen from Grandpa Joe, she'd been systematically defrauding multiple people and institutions while risking our father's business in the process. Those loan defaults are part of why your construction company lost its credit rating, Robert told Dale gently. Madison's fraudulent applications created liens against your business assets. Dale buried his face in his hands. She destroyed my business to fund her shopping addiction. The shocking twist that changed everything came in what Patricia revealed next. There's more, she said grimly. We discovered that Madison never actually planned to marry Trevor. Trevor's head snapped up. What do you mean? She's been simultaneously engaged to 2 other men, Patricia explained, pulling out photographs and social media screenshots. Marcus Williams in Seattle and David Chen in Portland. She's been collecting engagement rings and planning multiple weddings while maintaining separate social media accounts for each relationship. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Carol, who had defended Madison throughout this crisis, looked stunned by the revelation that her daughter was essentially operating marriage scams. She's been using the engagement announcements to justify borrowing money for wedding expenses, Robert continued. Each fiancé believes he's her only relationship, and each set of families has been contributing to wedding costs. Trevor stood up abruptly and walked to our front window, staring out at the street, while he processed the complete destruction of everything he'd believed about the woman he'd planned to marry. How long have you known about this? He asked without turning around. We hired a private investigator 3 days ago, Patricia admitted. After learning about the stolen money, we wanted to understand who Madison really was before making any decisions about helping your family. Carol found her voice finally. She's my daughter. I don't understand how this happened. How did she become someone who could do these things? Addiction, Robert said simply. Shopping addiction, gambling addiction, fraud addiction. Madison gets a dopamine rush from acquiring things and deceiving people. She's lost the ability to distinguish between wants and needs, between truth and lies. Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a formal agreement. This brings us to our offer. We're prepared to pay Joe's full medical expenses plus an additional $10,000 to help your family recover from Madison's financial damage. But our conditions are non-negotiable. She handed the document to Dale. First, Madison must enter a residential treatment program for addiction and personality disorders. Minimum 6 months, possibly longer, depending on her progress. Second, she must make full restitution to every person she's defrauded with a payment plan supervised by the court system. Third, she must have no contact with our family, including Trevor, for a minimum of 2 years. And fourth, Robert added, she must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law for elder abuse and fraud. We will not enable her behavior by allowing her to escape legal consequences. Trevor turned away from the window to face his parents. I want to add a 5th condition. Madison must publicly acknowledge what she's done to Joe and apologize to the entire community she's victimized. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more hiding behind family loyalty. As I listened to these decent people offer to save my grandfather's life while insisting on accountability for Madison's crimes, I realized they were giving our family something more valuable than money. They were giving us the opportunity to choose integrity over dysfunction, justice over enabling, and healing over denial. The question now was whether Madison would accept their terms or continue her pattern of running away from consequences. Either way, Grandpa Joe would get his life-saving treatment, and our family would finally be forced to confront the reality of who Madison had become. The next morning, Madison finally returned home, arriving with the kind of dramatic flair she'd always used to control family situations. She swept through our front door wearing a new outfit that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries, her hair professionally styled and her makeup perfect, despite the chaos she'd left behind. "I've been thinking about this whole situation," she announced before anyone could speak, "and I've decided what needs to happen." Carol looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been sitting with Dale, surrounded by legal documents and medical bills. "Madison, we need to talk about the Patterson family's offer and the conditions they've set." "I don't care about their conditions," Madison replied dismissively. "Trevor needs to choose between his controlling parents and the woman he loves. Either he stands up to them and we proceed with our wedding as planned, or I'm done with this relationship." The audacity of her ultimatum left the room speechless. After everything we'd discovered about her lies, theft, and multiple engagements, Madison was still trying to manipulate Trevor into choosing her over his own family's moral standards. Dale found his voice first. "Madison, you stole $28,000 from your dying grandfather. You've been lying to all of us for months. You can't just pretend none of that happened." "Everyone makes mistakes," Madison said with a careless shrug. "The important thing is that Trevor and I love each other enough to work through our problems." I watched my sister's performance with growing amazement at her complete disconnection from reality. She seemed genuinely convinced that her charm and manipulation tactics would continue working despite the mountain of evidence proving her deception. "Have you talked to Trevor about your ultimatum?" Carol asked carefully. "Not yet," Madison replied confidently, "but I know he'll make the right choice. We're soulmates. His parents just don't understand our connection." The devastating twist came when Trevor arrived unexpectedly, having apparently decided to confront Madison directly about what his parents had discovered. He walked into our kitchen looking determined and carrying a manila folder that I suspected contained copies of the private investigator's findings. When Madison saw him, her face lit up with the brilliant smile she'd always used to get her way. "Trevor, baby, perfect timing," she said, moving toward him with open arms. "I was just telling my family about the decision you need to make." But Trevor stepped back from her embrace, his expression cold and unreadable. "Actually, Madison, I'm here to talk about some decisions you need to make." He set the folder on our kitchen counter and opened it, revealing photographs, bank statements, and legal documents that represented the complete destruction of Madison's carefully constructed lies. "I spent yesterday in Seattle meeting with Marcus Williams," Trevor said quietly. "Interesting guy. He was very surprised to learn that his fiancée, Madison Walsh, was also engaged to someone named Trevor Patterson in Colorado." Madison's confident expression faltered slightly, but she attempted to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then let me clarify." Trevor continued pulling out a photograph of Madison wearing a different engagement ring while embracing a tall man with dark hair. "This is you and Marcus at your engagement party in Seattle 6 weeks ago. You're wearing the ring he bought you while planning a wedding for next spring." The color drained from Madison's face, but she tried one more lie. "That's not what it looks like." Trevor pulled out another photograph, this one showing Madison with a third man in what appeared to be a romantic restaurant setting. "And this is you with David Chen in Portland, wearing yet another engagement ring during what his family believes was your engagement celebration." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Madison seemed to realize that her web of deception had finally collapsed completely. 3 engagement rings. Trevor said, his voice steady but filled with disgust. 3 sets of wedding plans. 3 families contributing money for wedding expenses that were never intended to happen. Madison's mask finally slipped, revealing the calculating person she'd become underneath her charming facade. "So what?" she said defiantly. "I never promised any of you exclusivity until we were actually married." The shocking admission that she viewed multiple simultaneous engagements as acceptable behavior left everyone stunned. Even Carol, who had defended Madison throughout this crisis, looked horrified by her daughter's casual attitude towards such massive deception. "You collected engagement rings like trophies," Trevor continued. "You used our relationships to justify borrowing money from our families and friends. You planned to disappear once you'd extracted enough cash from all of us." "That's not true," Madison protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Trevor opened another section of the folder. "Actually, it is true. My parents' investigator found evidence that you've done this before. Same pattern in Phoenix 2 years ago and before that in Dallas. You find wealthy men get engaged, collect money for wedding expenses, then disappear before the actual ceremony." The revelation that Madison was essentially a professional marriage scammer operating across multiple states transformed our understanding of who she'd become. This wasn't just poor judgment or shopping addiction. This was systematic fraud, targeting wealthy families. Dale stood up from the table, his face reflecting a mixture of heartbreak and disgust. "You're not my daughter anymore. I don't know who you are, but the Madison I raised wouldn't steal from her dying grandfather or run marriage scams across the country." Madison's response showed just how far she'd fallen from any sense of normal human empathy. "You're all being ridiculous. Grandpa is going to die anyway. At least this way some of his money went towards something beautiful instead of just prolonging the inevitable." The casual cruelty of dismissing Grandpa Joe's life as worthless while describing her fraud as something beautiful was the final straw for Trevor. He closed the folder and looked at Madison with complete contempt. "I came here to give you one last chance to tell the truth and accept responsibility for what you've done," he said quietly. "But I can see that you're incapable of honesty or remorse." He pulled his phone from his pocket and speed-dialed a number. "Detective Rodriguez, this is Trevor Patterson. Madison Walsh is at her parents' house right now, and I think you should come collect her before she runs again." Madison's eyes widened with panic as she realized the legal consequences were finally catching up with her. "You can't call the police on your own fiancé." "You're not my fiancé," Trevor replied firmly. "You're a criminal who defrauded my family and stole money from a dying man. The engagement was based on lies, which means it never existed." As we waited for Detective Rodriguez to arrive, Madison made one last desperate attempt to manipulate the situation. She called Marcus Williams in Seattle and David Chen in Portland, trying to warn them about the investigation and coordinate their stories. But Trevor had already contacted both men, and they were cooperating with law enforcement in their respective cities. Madison's multi-state marriage scam was collapsing simultaneously across the country. When Detective Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes later, Madison was still trying to convince Trevor that their love could overcome any obstacles. Even as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she maintained that everyone was overreacting to simple misunderstandings. As I watched my sister being led away in the back of a police car, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Grandpa Joe would finally get justice, and sadness for the loss of the sister I'd once known and loved. The Madison who'd been arrested was a stranger wearing my sister's face, someone who'd chosen greed and deception over family and integrity. The real Madison, the one I'd grown up with, had disappeared years ago, replaced by someone I couldn't recognize or save. With Madison in custody, Detective Rodriguez was able to obtain search warrants for her apartment and personal financial records. What they discovered there completed the picture of her elaborate deception and revealed the true scope of her criminal enterprise. I accompanied Detective Rodriguez to Madison's apartment the next day, curious to see how someone who'd been systematically defrauding people had been living. The luxury building in downtown Denver featured granite countertops, hardwood floors, and amenities that would have cost at least $3,000 per month in rent. "She's 4 months behind on payments here," Detective Rodriguez explained as we entered the spacious one-bedroom unit. The property management company was preparing eviction proceedings. Inside, Madison's apartment looked like a high-end department store. Designer clothes filled 2 walk-in closets, many with price tags still attached. Expensive handbags lined built-in shelves and jewelry boxes contained hundreds of pieces that sparkled under the overhead lighting. Compulsive shopping disorder. Detective Rodriguez observed, photographing the evidence. She was buying things she couldn't afford and would never use just to get the dopamine rush from acquiring new possessions. But the real revelation came when we found Madison's home office, where she'd been coordinating her multiple relationships and tracking her various fraudulent schemes. 3 different laptops sat on her desk, each one dedicated to a different fiancé and set of social media accounts. "Look at this," Detective Rodriguez said, opening a filing cabinet filled with meticulously organized folders. She has detailed records of every person she's borrowed money from, including psychological profiles and manipulation strategies. I opened one of the folders labeled Holly Family Dynamics and found pages of notes about our family's financial situation, Grandpa Joe's health concerns, and our parents' emotional weaknesses. Madison had been studying us like test subjects, identifying the best ways to exploit our love and trust. Another folder labeled Trevor Patterson Research contained background information about his family's business, their net worth, and detailed plans for extracting money through wedding expenses. She'd calculated exactly how much she could steal before anyone became suspicious. "Your sister is essentially a sociopath," Detective Rodriguez said grimly. "She's been treating human relationships like business transactions with no regard for the emotional damage she causes." The devastating twist came when we found the folder labeled Resort Transaction Documentation. Inside were fake booking confirmations, fabricated correspondence with the Belize resort, and detailed scripts for explaining the honeymoon expenses to our family. "She never intended to go to Belize," Detective Rodriguez explained. "The entire story was fiction created to justify the theft of your grandfather's money." The fake documents were incredibly sophisticated, featuring official-looking letterhead confirmation numbers and even forged signatures from resort staff. Madison had invested significant time and effort into creating a believable cover story for her theft. Where did she learn to create such convincing forgeries? I asked, amazed by the professional quality of her deception. Detective Rodriguez opened another folder that answered my question. "She's been taking online courses in graphic design and document creation. She learned these skills specifically to support her fraudulent activities." As we continued searching through Madison's apartment, we found evidence of even more victims than we'd initially discovered. She'd been running romance scams on dating websites, targeting lonely older men and convincing them to send money for various fabricated emergencies. I count at least 37 separate victims across 6 states, Detective Rodriguez said, reviewing Madison's carefully maintained records. She's stolen over $200,000 in the past 3 years. The scope of Madison's criminal enterprise was staggering. She'd turned deception into a full-time career, treating fraud like a legitimate business with detailed planning, customer research, and profit projections. But the most disturbing discovery came when we found her personal journal, where she'd written about her victims with complete emotional detachment. Grandpa Joe, trust level maximum. Exploitable through family loyalty and health fears. Read one entry. Trevor Patterson, ego-driven, needs constant validation. Best approach through wedding fantasy scenarios. She wrote about your family like you were marks in a con game, Detective Rodriguez observed. There's no emotional attachment here, no recognition that she was hurting people who loved her. As we completed the search and prepared to leave Madison's apartment, I realized that discovering the truth about the resort money was just the beginning of understanding who my sister had really become. She hadn't just stolen Grandpa Joe's medical fund, she'd been systematically exploiting everyone who cared about her while maintaining a facade of loving granddaughter and devoted fiancé. That evening, I returned to the hospital to update Grandpa Joe about what we'd discovered. He was sitting up in his bed, looking slightly stronger after receiving some preliminary medical treatments funded by community donations to his crowdfunding campaign. "So the money never went to any resort," he said after I finished explaining Madison's elaborate deception. "She just used my medical fund to pay off her shopping debts." "That's right," I confirmed. and she had detailed plans for stealing even more money from Trevor's family after the wedding. Grandpa Joe was quiet for a long moment, processing the reality that his granddaughter had viewed him as nothing more than a source of cash to fund her criminal lifestyle. "You know what hurts the most?" he said finally. "It's not the money, Holly, it's the complete lack of love." Madison looked at me and saw only an obstacle to overcome, not a person who cared about her. His words captured the true tragedy of what Madison had become. Somewhere in her pursuit of material possessions and easy money, she'd lost the ability to value human relationships or recognize the love that had always surrounded her. As I sat beside Grandpa Joe's hospital bed, I realized that recovering his stolen money was only part of solving this crisis. The deeper challenge would be rebuilding our family's trust and healing from the betrayal of someone we'd all cherished and protected. The next morning, District Attorney Michael Chen called a press conference to announce the charges being filed against Madison. The case had attracted media attention because of the elder abuse component and the interstate nature of her fraud scheme. I watched from the courthouse steps as DA Chen explained the 17 felony charges Madison faced, including elder abuse theft, fraud forgery, and operating a criminal enterprise across multiple states. The potential sentence ranged from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. Ms. Walsh systematically targeted vulnerable individuals, including her own elderly grandfather, who needed money for life-saving medical treatment, DA Chen announced to the gathered reporters. This case represents one of the most callous examples of elder abuse we've prosecuted in Jefferson County. Detective Rodriguez stood beside the DA, adding details about the multi-state investigation that had uncovered Madison's previous victims. "We're working with law enforcement agencies in Arizona, Texas, Washington, and Oregon to coordinate prosecutions in their jurisdictions as well." The media coverage was extensive, with local news stations featuring interviews with some of Madison's victims and highlighting the community fundraising efforts for Grandpa Joe's medical treatment. The story resonated with viewers because it combined elder abuse, family betrayal, and the contrast between good people helping and bad people exploiting. That afternoon, Madison appeared in court for her arraignment. I attended with Dale and Carol, wanting to see how she would respond when confronted with the full scope of the charges against her. Madison entered the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit, her usual polished appearance replaced by the harsh reality of incarceration. She looked smaller, somehow diminished without her designer clothes and professional makeup. Judge Patricia Williams read the charges aloud, a process that took nearly 10 minutes due to the extensive list of crimes across multiple victims and jurisdictions. Madison's court-appointed attorney, James Mitchell, entered a plea of not guilty to all charges. "Your Honor," Attorney Mitchell said during the bail hearing, "my client is a local resident with strong family ties and no prior criminal history. She poses no flight risk to the community." The devastating moment came when DA Chen responded with evidence that contradicted everything Madison's lawyer had claimed about her character and background. "Your Honor, the defendant has been operating under multiple false identities across 6 states," DA Chen announced. "She has driver's licenses in 3 different names, maintains bank accounts under aliases, and has demonstrated a clear pattern of fleeing jurisdictions when law enforcement begins investigating her activities." He presented a folder containing documentation of Madison's previous escape attempts and the sophisticated false identity systems she'd created to avoid prosecution. "Furthermore," DA Chen continued, "the defendant attempted to board a flight to Mexico yesterday morning using a fake passport. She was only detained because airport security recognized her from media coverage of this case." The revelation that Madison had tried to flee the country while on bail shocked everyone in the courtroom, including her own attorney. Judge Williams immediately revoked bail and ordered Madison held in custody pending trial. As Madison was led away in handcuffs, she made eye contact with Dale for the first time since her arrest. Instead of remorse or apology, her expression conveyed anger and resentment, as if she blamed our family for her legal troubles, rather than accepting responsibility for her own actions. Later that week, Trevor's parents kept their promise and paid the full amount for Grandpa Joe's medical treatment. Robert Patterson handed me a certified check for $28,000 during a brief ceremony at the hospital with local media covering the generous donation. Joe Walsh represents the values that built this community, Robert said during his remarks to reporters. When good people face difficult circumstances through no fault of their own, it's our responsibility to help however we can. The contrast between the Patterson family's generosity and Madison's criminal selfishness couldn't have been more stark. While Madison had stolen money from a dying man to fund her shopping addiction, the Pattersons were using their resources to save a stranger's life because it was the right thing to do. Dr. Martinez scheduled Grandpa Joe's surgery for the following Monday, expressing optimism about his chances for recovery, given the early intervention made possible by the community's fundraising efforts and the Patterson family's donation. The experimental procedure has shown promising results in patients with Mr. Walsh's condition, she explained during a family consultation. We caught his deterioration in time to give him a real chance at meaningful recovery. But even as we celebrated securing Grandpa Joe's treatment, the legal consequences for Madison continued escalating. Federal prosecutors filed additional charges related to mail fraud and interstate transportation of stolen property, potentially adding another decade to her potential sentence. Defense attorney Mitchell contacted our family about a potential plea agreement. Madison is willing to plead guilty to the elder abuse charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 10 years, he explained during a phone call with Dale. The offer required our family's approval since Grandpa Joe was the primary victim. We met to discuss the decision that evening, gathering around Grandpa Joe's hospital bed to consider whether accepting a shorter sentence was better than risking trial. "What do you think, Grandpa?" I asked. "It's your money she stole, so the decision should be yours." Grandpa Joe was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of showing mercy to someone who had shown him none. "I think 10 years is appropriate," he said finally. "Madison needs serious help for her addictions and criminal thinking, but she's still family. If she uses that time to get treatment and make amends to her victims, maybe there's hope for redemption." His grace and forgiveness, even after everything Madison had put him through, reminded me why he was the most admirable person I'd ever known. Even facing his own mortality, he could find compassion for someone who had betrayed him completely. DHN accepted the plea agreement with conditions requiring Madison to make full restitution to all identified victims and undergo mandatory psychological treatment during her incarceration. The formal sentencing was scheduled for the following month. As I left the courthouse after the plea hearing, I realized that justice had been served, but the real work of healing our family was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Grandpa Joe's surgery was a complete success. Dr. Martinez emerged from the operating room with a smile that told us everything we needed to know before she said a word. "The experimental procedure worked better than we hoped," she announced to our anxious family gathered in the surgical waiting area. "We were able to restore significant blood flow to his heart muscle, and his vital signs throughout the procedure were excellent." The recovery process was remarkable to witness. Within days, Grandpa Joe showed improvement that exceeded everyone's expectations. His energy returned gradually, his breathing became easier, and his cognitive sharpness, which had seemed to decline during the stress of recent events, came back stronger than before. "I feel like I've been given a second chance at life," he told me during one of my daily hospital visits. "Not just because of the surgery, but because of how this whole experience showed me what really matters." The devastating twist that none of us had anticipated came in how much better Grandpa Joe felt once the experimental treatment began working. Dr. Martinez explained that his previous symptoms had been masking the true extent of his cognitive abilities. Many elderly patients experience what appears to be mental decline when they're dealing with severe cardiac issues, she explained. The reduced blood flow affects brain function, creating symptoms that look like dementia but are actually reversible with proper treatment. Grandpa Joe's paranoia about banks, which had started this entire crisis, completely disappeared once his heart function improved. He remembered clearly giving me the money for safekeeping, but acknowledged that his thinking had been clouded by his cardiac condition. "I wasn't thinking clearly about financial security," he admitted. "The heart problems were affecting my judgment more than I realized." The community support that had emerged during his medical crisis continued even after his recovery began. Veterans organizations, church groups, and neighborhood associations had rallied around Grandpa Joe, creating connections and friendships that enriched his life beyond what any of us had expected. "I've lived in this community for 40 years. He marveled, but I never knew how many good people were right here around me. Dale's situation also began improving dramatically once the truth about Madison's deceptions became clear. Robert Patterson kept his promise to help with the business recovery, offering Dale a subcontracting partnership that provided steady work and the opportunity to rebuild his professional reputation. I've learned more about business ethics and financial responsibility in the past month than in 20 years of running my own company," Dale told me as we reviewed his new partnership contracts. "Robert insists on transparency and accountability in everything, which is exactly what I need to learn." The partnership proved beneficial for both men. Robert's company gained access to Dale's skilled craftsmanship and local knowledge, while Dale received mentorship in business management and ethical practices that helped him understand how his previous financial decisions had contributed to the family crisis. Carol's transformation was equally significant. The shock of discovering Madison's true character had forced her to examine her own parenting choices and family dynamics. She began seeing a counselor who specialized in family systems and enabling behaviors. "I realized I'd been protecting Madison from consequences her entire life," Carol explained during one of our conversations. "Every time she got in trouble, I made excuses or fixed things for her instead of letting her learn from her mistakes." The counseling helped Carol understand how her desire to keep peace in the family had actually enabled Madison's increasingly destructive behavior. She began setting boundaries and expectations that should have been established years earlier. "As for my own situation, the resolution of the crisis gave me clarity about my future direction. The experience of advocating for Grandpa Joe and navigating the legal system had shown me strengths and interests I hadn't recognized before. Have you ever considered law school?" Patricia Henley, the elder abuse attorney, asked during one of our follow-up meetings. "You have natural instincts for advocacy work, and we always need attorneys who understand family dynamics and elder care issues." The suggestion intrigued me more than I expected. My work as a dental hygienist was stable and comfortable, but the idea of specializing in elder advocacy felt like a calling that could give deeper meaning to my career. I began researching law school programs that offered evening classes for working students. The prospect of spending 3 years in school while maintaining my current job was daunting, but the experience with Grandpa Joe had shown me how much difference one person could make in protecting vulnerable family members. The crowdfunding campaign had generated more money than needed for Grandpa Joe's medical expenses, creating a surplus that he decided to use for establishing a community resource program. "I want to create something that helps other families avoid what we went through," he announced during a family meeting 6 weeks after his surgery. "Too many elderly people are vulnerable to financial abuse because they don't know where to get help." With the extra donations and matching funds from the Patterson family, Grandpa Joe established the Walsh Family Elder Advocacy Center, a nonprofit organization that provided legal resources, financial counseling, and support services for elderly abuse victims. The center operated out of a small office space, donated by Robert Patterson, staffed by volunteer attorneys, social workers, and trained advocates who helped families navigate crisis situations similar to what we'd experienced. Every week we get calls from families dealing with financial abuse, medical decision conflicts, or exploitation by relatives, Grandpa Joe told me as he showed me around the center's offices. "It breaks my heart to know how common these problems are." The Advocacy Center also provided educational programs for elderly residents, teaching them about financial security legal rights and warning signs of potential exploitation. Grandpa Joe became a popular speaker at senior centers and community groups, sharing his story to help others recognize and prevent elder abuse. His energy and purpose in this new role were remarkable to witness. Rather than becoming bitter about Madison's betrayal, he'd channeled his experience into helping others, transforming personal trauma into community service. "Madison's theft nearly killed me," he reflected during one of our conversations. "But surviving it gave me a mission I never would have discovered otherwise. Maybe that's how healing works sometimes." Madison's sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 4 months after Grandpa Joe's surgery. The courthouse was packed with her victims, community members, and media representatives who'd been following the case since her arrest. I attended with Dale and Carol, while Grandpa Joe chose to participate via video link from the Elder Advocacy Center, rather than face the stress of appearing in person. Trevor and his parents sat in the front row, having decided to witness the conclusion of a case that had impacted their family significantly. Judge Patricia Williams called the hearing to order and began by reading victim impact statements from Madison's numerous targets across multiple states. The litany of financial and emotional damage was overwhelming, representing decades of stolen dreams and broken trust. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson from Phoenix writes that she gave Madison $3,000 for dental treatment that never existed. Judge Williams read, "She says the betrayal by someone she considered family was more devastating than the financial loss." Marcus Williams from Seattle states that he spent $15,000 on engagement rings and wedding deposits for a woman who was simultaneously engaged to 2 other men. He says the emotional trauma has made it impossible for him to trust anyone enough for a serious relationship. The victim impact statements continued for over an hour each one, detailing not just financial losses, but the deeper psychological damage caused by Madison's systematic deception. Many victims described feeling foolish and embarrassed, questioning their ability to judge character and trust future relationships. When it was time for Madison to address the court, she stood up slowly, wearing a standard prison uniform that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the polished manipulator who'd been arrested months earlier. The surprising twist came in what she said during her statement to the court. "Your Honor, I want to accept full responsibility for everything I've done." Madison began, her voice steady but quiet. "For months, I've been trying to convince myself that my actions were justified, or that everyone was overreacting. But the court-mandated counseling has helped me understand the real impact of my crimes." She turned to face the gallery, making eye contact with the victims and family members who'd come to hear her sentencing. "I stole money from my grandfather while he was dying," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I betrayed people who loved me and trusted me. I destroyed relationships and damaged lives for no reason except my own selfish desires." The acknowledgement of responsibility was more than anyone had expected from someone who'd shown no remorse throughout her arrest and legal proceedings. "The therapy sessions have helped me understand that I was addicted to the excitement of deception and the temporary high of acquiring new possessions," Madison explained. "But those addictions don't excuse the harm I caused to innocent people." She pulled out a handwritten letter and addressed it to Grandpa Joe via the video link. "Grandpa Joe, I can't undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. You trusted me with your life savings, and I betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. I'm grateful that you survived and that the community came together to help you, but I know that doesn't eliminate my responsibility for nearly killing you through my theft." The sincerity in her voice suggested that the mandatory counseling had begun breaking through the psychological barriers that had allowed her to rationalize her criminal behavior. "I'm requesting the maximum sentence." Madison continued, shocking everyone in the courtroom. "I need intensive treatment for my addictions and criminal thinking, and my victims deserve to know that I'm facing serious consequences for the harm I caused." Judge Williams asked Madison's attorney if he'd advised her to request a harsh sentence, but Attorney Mitchell confirmed that it was entirely her decision based on her therapeutic progress. My client has been working with an excellent forensic psychologist who specializes in addiction and antisocial behavior, he explained. Dr. Sarah Chen has helped Madison understand the psychological roots of her criminal thinking and the importance of accepting genuine accountability. The court psychologist's report, which Judge Williams read aloud, revealed that Madison's problems went deeper than simple greed or shopping addiction. Dr. Chen's evaluation indicates that Ms. Walsh suffers from narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features combined with severe impulse control disorders and addiction issues, Judge Williams explained. However, she also shows genuine capacity for insight and behavioral change with proper treatment. The report recommended a lengthy prison sentence with mandatory psychological treatment, followed by supervised probation with continued therapy and victim restitution requirements. The defendant requires intensive intervention to address the personality disorders that enabled her criminal behavior. Judge Williams continued reading. But Dr. Chen believes that with proper treatment, Ms. Walsh can develop empathy and ethical reasoning skills that would prevent future offenses. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Williams delivered a decision that balanced justice with the possibility of redemption. Madison Walsh, you are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with eligibility for early release after 8 years contingent on successful completion of all treatment programs and victim restitution requirements, she announced. Upon release, you will serve 5 years of supervised probation with continued psychological counseling. The sentence was longer than the plea agreement had specified, but Judge Williams explained that Madison's request for maximum consequences had influenced her decision to prioritize treatment and accountability over leniency. I'm also ordering that any money earned through prison work programs be dedicated to victim restitution, Judge Williams added. Ms. Walsh will not benefit financially from her incarceration until all victims are compensated fully. As Madison was led away to begin her sentence, she made eye contact with our family one final time. Instead of the anger and resentment she'd shown during her arrest, her expression conveyed something that looked like genuine remorse and determination to change. That evening, Grandpa Joe called a family meeting at the Elder Advocacy Center to discuss how we wanted to handle Madison's incarceration and potential future relationship with our family. I've decided to visit her in prison once she's settled into the treatment program, he announced, surprising everyone with his willingness to maintain contact. Are you sure about that, Grandpa? I asked. After everything she put you through, she's still my granddaughter, he replied simply. If the therapy is really helping her understand what she did wrong, then maybe there's hope for her to become the person she was meant to be before addiction and mental illness took over. His capacity for forgiveness, even after nearly dying because of Madison's theft, reminded me why he was the strongest person I'd ever known. Grandpa Joe understood that true justice included the possibility of redemption even for someone who'd betrayed his trust completely. As we discussed the family's future relationship with Madison, I realized that her sentencing marked the end of one chapter in our story and the beginning of another one focused on healing growth and the long process of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by betrayal. 1 year later, I stood in the conference room of the Walsh Family Elder Advocacy Center, looking out at a dozen elderly residents who'd gathered for our weekly financial safety workshop. Grandpa Joe was leading the discussion, sharing his story with the kind of dignity and wisdom that had emerged from surviving his own family's betrayal. The most important thing to remember, he was telling the group, is that financial abuse often comes from people we trust the most. Family members, caregivers, and close friends have the access and knowledge needed to exploit our resources. Mrs. Dorothy Hanson, an 84-year-old widow, raised her hand with a question. But how do we protect ourselves without becoming suspicious of everyone who wants to help us? Grandpa Joe smiled with understanding. That's the challenge, Dorothy. We need to create systems that protect our assets while still allowing us to maintain loving relationships with family. I watched him explain the difference between reasonable caution and paranoid isolation, drawing from his own experience of hiding money under mattresses versus establishing proper legal safeguards for financial security. If I had set up a proper power of attorney arrangement with Holly instead of just asking her to hide cash, he continued, the theft couldn't have happened the way it did. The workshop was one of many programs we'd developed at the Advocacy Center over the past year. Our success in helping families had attracted attention from state agencies and other communities, leading to requests for expanding the program beyond Jefferson County. After the workshop ended and the participants headed home with new knowledge about protecting themselves, Grandpa Joe and I sat down to review the center's annual report. The numbers were remarkable. We'd helped over 300 families navigate elder abuse situations, recovered more than $2 million in stolen funds, and provided legal assistance that had prevented countless additional crimes. I never imagined we'd accomplish so much in just 1 year, I told him as we reviewed the case summaries. That's because we understand what families go through, he replied. When someone calls us about a relative stealing money or pressuring them to change their will, we know exactly how they feel. My own life had changed dramatically since that terrible day when Dale found the money under my mattress. I'd completed my first year of law school, attending evening classes, while continuing to work part-time as a dental hygienist and volunteering at the Advocacy Center. The combination was exhausting but fulfilling in ways I'd never experienced before. My constitutional law professor had praised my understanding of due process rights, noting that my real-world experience with elder abuse cases gave me insights that purely academic students lacked. You see the human impact of legal decisions, Professor Williams had told me after a class discussion about criminal justice. That perspective will make you a better advocate for vulnerable clients. Dale's partnership with Robert Patterson had evolved into a thriving construction business that specialized in home modifications for elderly residents. They'd found a niche market in creating accessible bathrooms, ramp installations, and safety improvements that allowed seniors to age in place safely. Every project feels meaningful, Dale explained as we toured one of his recent installations. We're helping families stay together instead of just building decorative additions. The work had also helped Dale process his guilt about enabling Madison's theft. Each home modification project was a way of making amends to the elderly community he'd inadvertently harmed through his poor judgment. Carol had become the volunteer coordinator at a senior center across town, organizing activities and support services that helped isolated elderly residents build social connections. Her experience with Madison's manipulation had made her particularly skilled at identifying and preventing financial exploitation. I can spot the warning signs now, she told me during one of our monthly family dinners. Sudden changes in behavior, unexplained financial stress, new helpful friends who always seem to need money. The patterns are easier to see when you know what to look for. As for Madison, she'd been participating in intensive therapy at the federal prison facility, working with specialists who treated personality disorders and criminal thinking patterns. According to letters she'd been sending, Grandpa Joe, the treatment was challenging but effective. I'm learning that my entire adult life was built around deception and manipulation, she'd written in her most recent letter. The therapists are helping me understand how I lost the ability to form genuine relationships based on love instead of what I could get from people. Her progress reports from the prison psychologist were cautiously optimistic. Dr. Chen noted significant improvements in Madison's ability to recognize the impact of her actions on others and develop genuine empathy for her victims. Grandpa Joe had visited Madison twice, accompanied by Carol and a family counselor who specialized in reconciliation after serious betrayal. The visits were emotionally difficult, but seemed to be helping both of them process the trauma and begin rebuilding some form of relationship. She's not the same person who stole my money, Grandpa Joe had told me after the second visit. I can see glimpses of the little girl I used to know, the one who had empathy and kindness before addiction and mental illness took over. Trevor had moved on with his life, eventually meeting someone who shared his values and appreciated his family's integrity. He'd sent a card on the anniversary of Grandpa Joe's surgery, expressing gratitude for the experience that had shown him the importance of character over superficial charm. "Meeting your family taught me what real love looks like," he'd written. "Your grandfather's forgiveness and your strength in fighting for what's right showed me the kind of person I want to be and the kind of family I want to create." The Patterson family had become close friends of ours with Robert and Patricia, regularly attending our advocacy center events and contributing both financial support and business expertise to help us expand our programs. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that devastating afternoon, when I discovered the theft, I realized that the crisis had revealed both the worst and best of human nature. Madison's betrayal had nearly destroyed our family, but the community's response had restored my faith in the fundamental goodness that connects us all. The money hidden under my mattress was meant to protect Grandpa Joe's life, and despite being stolen, it had ultimately served that purpose in ways none of us could have anticipated. The theft had brought our family face to face with difficult truths about enabling and accountability, but it had also shown us the power of justice, forgiveness, and community support. Standing in the advocacy center that had grown from the ashes of our family crisis, I understood that protecting vulnerable people requires both individual courage and collective action. Grandpa Joe's near-death experience had become the foundation for helping hundreds of other elderly residents avoid similar betrayals. The journey from victim to advocate had taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing the harm that was done. Instead, it means transforming that experience into something that prevents others from suffering the same way. As I prepared to leave the center that evening, Grandpa Joe called me over to his desk, where he was reviewing applications from other communities that wanted to establish similar advocacy programs. "Holly, I have a question for you," he said with a twinkle in his eye that reminded me of the grandfather I'd known before his heart problems. "How would you feel about expanding this program statewide? We've gotten requests from Denver, Colorado Springs, and Grand Junction to help them set up elder advocacy centers." The opportunity to take our successful model and help protect vulnerable elderly people across Colorado felt like the natural next step in my journey from dental hygienist to elder rights advocate. "I think that's exactly what we should do," I replied. "But I have one condition we name the statewide program the Joseph Walsh Elder Protection Initiative." Grandpa Joe's smile was brighter than I'd seen since before his heart attack. "That would be an honor, sweetheart, but only if you promise to be the first director once you finish law school." As I drove home that night, thinking about the possibilities for expanding our advocacy work and the long road still ahead for Madison's rehabilitation, I realized that our family's darkest moment had become the beginning of our most meaningful work. The $28,000 hidden under my mattress had been stolen, but its true value had been multiplied far beyond what any of us could have imagined. Sometimes the worst betrayals become the foundation for the most important victories, and the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the greatest lessons about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of choosing justice over revenge. Before I sign off, I want to ask you something that's been on my mind since sharing this story. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between protecting someone you love and doing what you knew was right? Family loyalty is complicated, especially when it means holding people accountable for serious mistakes. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about how you've handled difficult family situations and what you've learned about the balance between forgiveness and justice. If this story resonated with you, or if you think it might help someone else who's dealing with family financial abuse, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories, and share it with others who might benefit from hearing about the warning signs of elder abuse. Your support helps these important stories reach the people who need them most. Thank you for listening to my family's journey through crisis and recovery. I hope our experience helps you recognize the strength you have to fight for what's right, even when it means confronting the people you love most. Remember that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when accountability feels like betrayal. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the vulnerable people in your life. They're counting on us to be their advocates when they can't advocate for themselves.